always say, a bank is a sandbox of interesting problems. And one of the things I love about this job and the bank is that, people can say, well, you're just a lawyer, stay in your swim lane. The people here don't say that.
Ian, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast today. I've been looking forward to it and glad that we could finally organize it.
No, listen, it's my pleasure. Between your schedule and my schedule, it's great that we could do this today.
Well, and I know many of our listeners look forward to hearing from you. It's certainly, your career has been inspiring and a lot of what you've accomplished. I think some of the tips that you will share will really resonate. So this will be fun.
I've been looking forward to it.
So Ian, we'll start with the basics. I mean, if you think about it, a lot of our audience, they may not necessarily know your background. So tell us about Ian, your upbringing, sort of where you grew up. What did that look like? It helps. I find that it helps our audience connect better with the participants in our podcast.
Absolutely, and I think, as hopefully people will see, my upbringing is actually a little bit of a reflection of where my career has actually gotten to. So my mother was French Canadian, born in Quebec. French was her first language. And my father, who's still alive at 94, is from South America, hence my last name, Arellano or Arellano. And they happened to meet in McGill. They met in McGill doing their master's degree, and both of them graduated with their master's in social work. So effectively, I'm the product of an immigrant father, French-Canadian mother, and notwithstanding the fact that her family, we can trace back the roots to first arrival in Quebec back to 1640. So a very common last name, Gagnon, in Quebec. So maybe that would put me on average, maybe the 1800s in terms of my background in Canada. But in reality, I grew up really feeling like a first generation Canadian. First, my father. Second, because we were living in English Canada. And of course, my mom didn't have any family or network here, very much like immigrants, and English was not her first language. So I really do think that was a lens that I saw. So again, the ethics of hard work, very big emphasis on education, etc. And, I guess sometimes, I probably am guilty of this with my kids. Some of the things that I may not like about my job or about, various pressures that we have, you kind of encourage your kids to do something different. And that was the case in terms of my parents, particularly my dad. So both parents being social workers, you're kind of dependent on the government saying that what you do is a priority. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. So really the echo chamber that I had at home in terms of career advice was do something you can be independent on. Do something that you've always got a profession that will be in demand, et cetera. So that was a little bit of the background that started shaping me. Although I always thought that I was going to be in business. I like that it kind of fit the criteria of being independent. I always thought kind of a smaller entrepreneurial, a little bit more of being the master of your own destiny philosophy. And, for various reasons, I didn't quite do that, but I try to keep some of those entrepreneurial spirits alive today.
Well, and it's an interesting background, Ian. And for our audience, when I first met Ian, I said, is it the Arellano, the Latin way, or the Italian way? And he said the Latin way.
And it's interesting. Again, having traveled to Spain and to Italy, and I'll date myself because when I first went to Italy, they had phone booths with phone books. And so I had always, particularly in Toronto, where there was a very heavy Italian background influence, immigration, everyone thought I was Italian. And so sure enough, here I am in Rome. I open up the phone book and there's 30 pages of Arellanos there, more in Spain. But because of Latin America, as far as I can tell, it came via Spain at some point.
No, and it's, but again, being in the languages business, I had to ask Ian that. I was like, you couldn't tell for sure. So which one are you?
Yeah.
and it is, it is interesting, Ian, how we are byproducts of our upbringing and how much our families contribute to that. And Ian, growing up, who do you think would had the best influence, or not the best, but the biggest influence on you?
So it's interesting. I think first of all, I considered myself privileged in the sense that, my parents were professional. Obviously, my father having, darker skin, coming from Latin America, certainly was very aware, that he was an immigrant. But in terms of, my upbringing and interaction at school and things like that, I thought I had a very lucky and privileged upbringing, education. It was kind of an immigrant's upbringing. I can remember wanting to have a bicycle for years before I got my first bicycle. And then when I was careless and it got stolen, I didn't get a new bike right away. And that's one of the things I worry about in terms of how we bring up our own kids, because, there is plentiful. And, sometimes we overspoil our kids and, you learn a lot about taking care of your things and value of money and things when it actually matters. So I think I was very lucky. I think, fortunately, school was fun for me. I enjoyed school. I had good friends. I had good teachers. There's always teachers that stand out in, I think, everybody's mind. And certainly there were a few that did that. And it was more about leaving open the possibility. So, at a certain stage, grade 5 in particular, I was in one of those split classes with the older kids, and the teacher basically said, here's the book, go do it. Here's the answer book, check your own work, and just kind of work at your own pace. And it kind of suited me. And I was in a group with other people, and we kind of worked as a team, and it was just a lot of fun.
No, and that's always interesting to hear those stories from the early days, Ian. And obviously law provided some of that independence you were looking for, and sort of that your parents had encouraged you to. Were there any other reasons that made you pick law as a career?
Well, first of all, law wasn't my first choice. So again, thinking that I was going into business, I, wanted to really get a background in business. And what I was really looking for in those days, it would have been like a Western HBA program, an undergrad business program, but I didn't do my research well enough, and I signed up for the Bachelor of Commerce program at U of T, and I quickly found out, and I'm not trying to offend any accountants who may be listening, that it was very geared towards accounting, and I found it a little bit too dry, too rules-based, and so after 2 years of that, a good friend of mine whose father was a lawyer, in fact, the only lawyer I knew growing up, he said, look, why don't we try to get into law school? And I said, well, but we don't have our degrees. And he said, no. If you get a good LSAT mark, you might be able to get in only after 2 years without completing your undergrad. So we both did it. And it was great because, again, it's good to embark on these journeys with good friends. Common experience. And so, I tell people I kind of got into law school through the rat hole that I think they've since closed. And so I kind of saved a little bit of time. But I have to say the accounting background has served me phenomenally well throughout my career, particularly in corporate law, M&A, et cetera. Having an understanding of financial statements, having an understanding of how they're put together, having an understanding of their limitations. It's just been a phenomenal advantage in terms of being able to interact with clients, being able to interact with clients on the other side, and be able to intellectually position things to the advantage of your client in a way that someone that's not familiar with the accounting and the background and purchase price adjustments and all those financial matters that are driven off of financial statements don't have that same type of familiarity.
And Ian, you went through law school, did that. Walk us a bit through your career in law, because some people may be familiar with it, but certainly some of our listeners will be hearing it for the first time.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I articled at McCarthy Tetro, and They had a great rotational program. Again, thinking that I liked business, etc. If I had to guess ahead of time, I'd be in the corporate law department, etc. And the first rotation I had was in litigation.
Oh, interesting.
And it was a very dynamic group. And I had a great mentor, and I was given a lot of responsibility. So, while I was articling, I did my own small claims court matters. And it's the same kind of issues that arise in larger trials, but obviously economically you can't go down and deal with things to the same degree. But I was given those run with it, and I found that, fascinating, interesting, exciting. I'm told, just amongst us that are listening here, contrary to the rules, I was given my own examinations for discovery to do as an articling student. I'm not sure I did them particularly well.
That's very unusual.
Yeah, but it was a great learning experience. And so the firm in litigation gave a lot of opportunity to young people. And in litigation, you get an exposure of what people do at more senior levels, but just the dollars of the claims and the disputes are less. But from a cost efficiency perspective, it doesn't make sense to have a more senior lawyer on it. And that's the only way to learn. The only way to learn is actually doing. You can't learn to drive a car without being behind the steering wheel, except maybe Elon Musk might disagree. But so it was a fantastic experience, and I was very seduced, by that experience. I then did my corporate rotation, and in corporate law, when you're a junior, it's quite different. Instead of seeing a whole transaction, you get slices. So you start off, you do diligence, but you're not in the negotiating room. You're not drafting the paper. So then 2 or 3 years later, your job kind of changes because you've done the diligence. Well, now you're drafting ancillary documents. 2 or 3 years later, you're now doing the main documents and you're in the negotiating room. So it's interesting. It was kind of a trade-off. And for me, I tend to be a fairly intense person. And I had a hard time in the litigation area not bringing the work home. My friends would go out for a beer, I'd be cross-examining them when they would say something, et cetera. And litigation is very intense. And I also found that from a scheduling perspective, I found it to be more unpredictable. You can prepare for a trial, then it settles, or you can not be ready, and then the cases ahead of you kind of collapse, and all of a sudden it's your turn to go. But what I loved about litigation is that it's a phenomenal place if you love to learn, because the litigators become instant experts in various areas, and then they move on and learn something else. And so if you have that desire to learn, you like fast pace, litigation is quite something. But I found it almost a little too intense, given my personality. So as a result, I chose to work in the corporate area, and it was a little bit more slow, a little bit more predictable. And life is, I think, often circumstance, right? People can try to plan, but a lot of things happen unplanned. And for me, when my career really started taking off is when I got introduced into some very complex transactions. You can be the best lawyer in the world in terms of raw material, but if you practice in Timmins and you don't have opportunity to do more complex work that may not find its way to Timmins, you'll never fully develop. And I was very lucky working in Toronto, but then working with some international clients, some big UK multinationals, for whatever reason, because of the businesses that were being bought or sold. The site of these transactions were here in Canada, and I was on teams, and I saw these lawyers from the UK doing very, very sophisticated contracts. And then I kind of like to figure things out. So I would look at the contracts, I'd study the contracts, try to figure out how they worked, reverse engineered the contracts. And, in a couple of years, I was really the firm expert on those very sophisticated global transaction. So I recall one transaction, we were acting for a client, multinational, and we bought 80 businesses in 57 countries. And when we came to the closing, we had little flags on the closing table, and a lot of these, for tax reasons, had to be closed in a certain sequence. And so we had everything orchestrated and kind of going through, looping into local counsel. Some documents had to be delivered and registered locally. Others could be delivered here. And that's the kind of thing that I really love, that kind of complexity, that orchestration of a team to get these complex results. And because of that, and again, this is where the circumstance arises. One of the partners at the firm, McCarthy's, when I was there, decided that they were going to go and teach, be a prof in Australia. And somebody said, okay, well, that person does a lot of work for Scotiabank. Scotiabank's doing a lot of stuff in South America. And hey, Ian, your last name, Scotiabank looks like you. So you get involved and don't screw it up. And that was kind of my introduction to Scotiabank. And the beauty of the Scotiabank opportunity, because again, it's the work, it's the clients that give you the opportunity to develop. And was that it was international work, and you would learn how to do deals in different countries. One of the things that I struggle here at the bank with my team is, how do I keep my team excited about the work they're doing, right? Lawyers by nature want to learn. They're curious. And they're human capital. Every night they go out the door, and you want them to make sure they come back in the morning and they're excited. So this issue of doing repetitious work, but now figure out how you do them in a different country. How do you do something in Brazil when they don't have that same corporate concept? Oh, but Brazil has an amazing concept that other countries have. We know about mergers. Well, Brazil and certain other Latin countries have a concept called demerger. So it's the opposite of merger, but you can pull companies apart. You don't have assignments of contracts. It's a kind of a process that involves sometimes court blessings, other times not. It's a fantastic tool. So working in teams with local counsel, then kind of figuring out how you adapt your tools to work in those jurisdictions was just, for me, an eye-opener. And it was just a source of learning, but it was also a source of specialization. Because after doing that, what else does Canada export in terms of capital? The resource industry. And so I started getting involved and getting some expertise on the mining side. And then I was doing for mining companies, in those days, Noranda, Falconbridge, et cetera, buying mines in Chile or looking at stuff in Australia. And so I called it my Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde practice, because I had very conservative banks who had much tighter risk tolerances, and then mining companies that will spend millions of dollars digging holes in the ground and finding nothing. So again, it created this balance, and it allowed me as a lawyer to have kind of different personas depending on who I'm negotiating. And a lot of, and people don't realize it, a lot of corporate law is advocacy. It truly is. When you're negotiating, it's if you can do a good job, negotiating, and I always like to say negotiating from a principled perspective, set out those principles, get everyone to agree, and then make all your points around those principles so it's easier for everyone to be nodding, in your direction.
Well, and I'm glad you like complexity, and that was one of the things that attracted you to corporate law, Ian, because there's no shortage of complexity in the banks, that's for sure.
I always say, a bank is a sandbox of interesting problems. And one of the things I love about this job and the bank is that, people can say, well, you're just a lawyer, stay in your swim lane. The people here don't say that. They look at the legal team as part of helping solve business problems, which then feeds my interest and my passion relating to business. But at the same time, we are preventative. And so we are open, we are welcomed usually, most of the time, with open arms and, invited to get involved early so that we prevent problems. And which means then there's huge opportunity for learning.
But Ian, that typically doesn't happen by accident. That typically means you fostered a culture of not being the no department, like you can't do that and you can't do that, and rather more collaborative. So how did you manage to do that and build that within your team as well? Because this would trickle, I imagine, through the legal department more broadly.
Yeah. First of all, I have to say I inherited a pretty good team, and I'm grateful to my predecessor, for that. Everyone is very passionate, and quite frankly, they believe in Scotiabank. When you look at, for example, things like our engagement levels, et cetera, higher than industry averages, et cetera. So people have worked here. If I look at the average tenure of the people in the legal group, et cetera, we're fairly long tenured. And that's great. And then the issue is then how do you maintain that excitement and desire? One of the things that I learned very quickly when I joined the bank, in an M&A transaction, knowing what's going on and having the complete picture is really important, because you've got to do things quickly, and they're like pieces of a Rubik's Cube. You solve one problem, it gives rise to a tax problem. And so you need to be able to move all the pieces together. And so when I came to the bank, my initial approach, when I met with my direct reports, hear what the issues are, then I would create, using Excel, a spreadsheet that would have the issues per person, what's the due date for the resolution, what's behind, what's not, and then my assistant would sort it. And so I'm meeting with person X, it would sort, and I'd go through the list. And after about maybe 2 weeks of that, I just couldn't keep up with it. It was so complex, so many issues, so many things. And one of the great things about the bank is that, the bank invests in people, and we had some management training, through the business school at Duke. I learned very quickly, you got to delegate. You got to have the right people, because if you can't trust them to deal with the issues, you've got the wrong people. Secondly, my job is not to be on top of every issue, quite the contrary. My job is to help remove boulders. And so my mantra or my model is, if the team is successful, I'm successful by definition. So my whole focus is to how to try to make or help the team be successful, and then everything else takes care of itself. And so the concept of kind of empowering, letting people make decisions, et cetera, is something that I clearly believe. One of my 2 rules, I'll tell you one of them. One of my 2 rules is I don't want to be a bottleneck. I don't want people sending me stuff, not making decisions, waiting for me to say, okay. Obviously, getting the right things for me to weigh in and give views is important. But at the same time, 95% of the stuff, I don't need to make that decision. Obviously, at the right time, someone could share it with me if it's important. But don't be a bottleneck, and help me not be a bottleneck. To me, that's rule number 1 of my job.
And Ian, can we ask what rule number 2 is?
I was teasing you on that one.
You knew I was going for it.
All right. Rule number 2 is I can do a fine job on my own being an idiot. So I need your help not to be an idiot. And by that, I mean, I need escalation. And by an idiot, quite frankly, and people always ask, what should you escalate? What should I? And I have a very simple rule. I say, if it's something that my boss or my peers are going to know about or should know about, you should be telling me, because otherwise I'm going to have the look of a deer in headlights when my boss is asking me a question that I know nothing about and it's legal. And so this goes back to the team and to communication, et cetera. And the other one is just this element of risk and helping protect the bank. And so I think, that's the culture that we try to have. And I think we've got it. I'm very, very happy with my team. We work very well together. I think we're effective. I always worry about when it's in-house, we have captive clients. So the kind of what I tell people is, we're making soup, and the customers in the bank have to eat the soup. How do we know our soup is any good? And so that need for feedback loop, that need for reaching out to the business, getting feedback. One of the indicia that I always look at, as a sign of success, if our lawyers are being included in business meetings at early stages, just to hear what the business is doing, not because there's a legal issue. The worst time to get a legal problem is at the end, when people have engineered a product or a service, and then now all of a sudden it's the legal group that's standing between realization or not because of a legal problem.
And Ian, I think that's great advice, because to the earlier question that I had, that is one of the things that your team getting invited early is the right fostering and the right culture that you're doing within the team. Otherwise, they would not. They would only get asked before, when somebody's worried, am I going to get in serious trouble if I do this? And let's often do it right.
Yeah.
And Ian, now technology is certainly evolving quickly, and in all the discussions we've had, you are very much a technophile. You're much more on top of technology than sort of the average business leader. But how do you manage to stay ahead on these things? How do you keep continuously learning?
So I guess first it comes to, I think people are good at what they like. And so luckily for me, I've always liked technology early on. I was very fortunate when I was in high school. We had a computer. It was, just to date myself, it was a computer that the first person in the class in the morning had to start up by flipping these little switches that were, we had a PDP-8, which was a big machine with tapes on the front, etc. So that the computer really captured my imagination. The thought that you could program a machine so it becomes essentially variable, that was just an incredible revelation to me. And we had all sorts. We had fantastic computer teachers, and it was come after school. You can use the computer because again, these were the days where they had those those vacuum card readers, and you put your programs through the punch cards, etc. But it was made available for people to use, to experiment, to play with, to have fun. I probably wasn't the most popular because, one of the first projects they asked me to do was to create an attendance system for the school. and so effectively we created, on the cards, a card for each student. The teachers would have someone run to the office, the cards of the students who were away. We would come to the computer room and we would print out, here's the attendance of who's away legitimately, would get distributed through the school. So it was done in a very practical way as well. And so that was kind of my early, learning to program, basic Fortran, et cetera. And so I've always had this positive, aptitude. When I started off as a young lawyer, there was some work that I did was very repetitious. And I figured out it had about 45 variables, depending on the flavors. It was issuing notes, different currencies, different interest rates, some guaranteed, some not guaranteed, but it was basically formulaic, 45 variables, combinations and permutations. And so in those days, law firms were using WordPerfect. And the one thing that I can say was certainly that WordPerfect was better than Word, is that you had an ability, we have the ability in Word, to copy and paste something, right? But it can hold one thing in memory. Well, with WordPerfect, you could hold 10 things in memory. And so you could manipulate information and using mail merges, 45 pieces of data, putting things together. And so I automated this system, and we had lawyers on the other side. They'd kick it off. It was very set, just like a dance, a kind of a dance from the ancient days of Venice. And they would have kind of the invitational telex that would have the variables. Then one party has to do a subscription agreement, other party has to do the notes, another party has to do, a guarantee, opinions, but they were all keyed off of these patterns and templates. And so I would purposely wait a little bit of time after they sent me stuff before I did it, because I didn't want them to figure out, like, how were you doing it so quickly? because of course I didn't want the competitors to catch up. So I've always liked the idea of technology being able to make things more efficient, make our jobs more interesting, so we can focus on really what the value add. And then I have to say, with kids, I have kids that are very exposed to technology, and being a competitive person, the natural order thing is always the kids will, outgrow their parents and outperform them, etc. But I like to pretend they haven't yet. So that's really what keeps me on trying to be on the edge.
Well, and you're certainly keeping up very well. And Ian, I have one. What I wanted to ask you is the job of the general counsel has certainly evolved a fair bit over the last few years. What if there was one tip that you could give to sort of chief legal officer, general counsel, most senior legal team members in-house out there, in your learnings over the years, what would it be?
No, it's interesting. Well, I look at my job and I say there's three components to my job. Part A is keeping the trains running on time. We're a public company. We know we've got to produce, disclosure documents, when they need to be filed. So all the stuff that is regular that I have in my calendar till 2026, 2027, it's already in my calendar. The second part is, we're the emergency room of the bank. The analogy I use is there's a circus. Some people will fall off the trapezes and they'll land into to the net that we have. And our job is to stitch people up and get them back out there. And so that then can have issues in terms of surge capacities when you have, unfortunately, issues, regulatory issues otherwise. And we obviously will get assistance, great assistance from external counsel. But you need to have that basic capability of doing the triage and doing what I would call the business as usual level of the emergency room department. The third part, which is the most interesting, and I am privileged because most of the people on my team really don't have enough time to devote to this, and this is where I feel is kind of part of my role for the team, is to be scanning the horizon for the icebergs. What's coming down the pipeline? Oh, California has a new privacy law. But you know what? We're not in California, but they're always ahead of the curve. So what are key things that people are looking at? Oh, right to be forgotten. Then I talk to our people who are building things, on the technology side. Are we designing our systems in a way that if we ever got to right to be forgotten, that we wouldn't have to re-engineer things so we could actually comply, et cetera? So to me, that's the fun part of the job, is looking for those trends, helping connect dots, asking questions internally. And I'm sure my team thinks I ask too many questions. Have we thought about this? What about this? And I think that part can be very valuable for an organization. And then the final part, but that you really have to consciously carve time out for, because it's the thing that will not get done when you're busy doing the first two parts of the job. And then, of course, the GC has a very special relationship with the CEO and with senior management. And in a way that, a CEO and the relationship with business heads, obviously, the business head has to perform, et cetera. The GC really can be that counselor, that advisor. Senior leaders want to bounce ideas off, et cetera, in a way that might be harder to do with other people who are actually engaged in the day-to-day business operations. And that is also quite rewarding as part of that.
No, and I think that's some really good and practical advice, Ian. And I like the breakdown because it makes it gives people some real takeaways to say, here's how I can tackle it. And Ian, I will ask you as for some general business advice that you may have for business leaders well beyond legal, because I framed that question on legal. But that'll be my last question for you. But before that, there's a certain portion of our podcast that we call the rapid fire questions.
Okay. All right. I'm ready.
So in this one, we're looking for sort of the simplest answer, whatever comes top of mind is supposed to be fun and interactive. So just first thing that comes to mind. What is your favorite word or phrase?
This is what I heard recently, and I've kind of adopted it. When all is said and done, more is said than done. And it's quite true.
It's so true. I may have to repurpose that one.
Well, I have a very reasonable royalty on that one.
What word or phrase do you hate?
I can't, or we can't. There is always a way, and sometimes even you have to rephrase the question.
And Ian, I read this somewhere, and I forget who said it, but it said, what it said was, whether you think you can or whether you think you can't, you are right.
Right, yeah.
And it really resonated with me because it's to your point. Can't is often sort of your own view on it. So.
Yeah, and you know what? I was at an interesting presentation yesterday, and it was actually a prof from the U.S., and he was talking about mindset, et cetera. And everyone has a little voice in their mind. And you can see it with kids, too, when that little voice starts being active. And you can have one of your kids, and we'll all be guilty of ourselves, where, taking the analogy to the child, I'm not good at math. I can't. And this concept of reframing and positive mindset, and it was a very little simple trick, a little hack. And it's just to put comma, yet. And I think that's really good. It's good for ourselves. It's good for how we raise our kids. There is always this opportunity for growth and for learning and for doing. Imagine all the things that people said couldn't be done that we're now doing as a human race.
100%. And so much of it just in the last 100 years alone.
Yeah.
And Ian, what word do you have a hard time, or phrase, have a hard time pronouncing, if any?
You know what? It's probably sometimes last names, because you have a little bit of a fear if you mispronounce it, you're going to embarrass yourself. You're going to be disrespectful, to people, etc. So I think it would be more of a category, and I'll have to say that is definitely an area that I need to improve on. Like they have all sorts of courses where they'll tell you how to remember people's names and things like that. And I was a dismal failure at those.
What is your favorite word or phrase in another language, if any?
So I'll tell you the translation in terms of what I've learned. It's an interesting one. You should be nice because you never know who your son or daughter's boss will be. And this concept about, we're such a small world. I really do believe, in the concept of, X degrees of separation, particularly in Canada, et cetera. We're relatively a small community. If people are lawyers or in the tech industry, by 1 or 2 degrees of separation, everybody knows everybody. And it's just better in life, being nice.
100%. And this, again, keeping up with our rapid fire questions. How many languages do you speak?
So I would say English only. Spanish, I'm conversational. I wouldn't practice law in Spanish just because of the technical. Certainly, it has absolutely helped, in doing business in Latin America. People do appreciate when you make an effort. And also it's actually kind of fun, to be in an elevator, people not thinking you speak Spanish and listen in on what people say, particularly if they're lawyers on the other side. But all joking aside, French was actually my first language. Again, French Canadian. Early on, my parents were in Montreal. I was born in Toronto, but we moved to Montreal. Then we moved back to Toronto, and being like, many kids, I didn't want to be different. And so, I just kind of refused to speak French. But I think 6 months I would be conversational French. My French is not as good as my Spanish, but 6 months immersed in French, I think I'd be pretty good.
And the last question, what's one word to describe yourself by?
Yeah, I would say curious. Which is,
I would agree, Ian. Just perpetual curiosity.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we're privileged. We live in an amazing time in terms of the world and technology, et cetera. And I think lawyers, by definition, are well trained to explain, to advocate. And I think lawyers will have a phenomenal role in organizations vis-a-vis the introduction of technology, safe technology, making sure that AI is not biased. There's a whole area, that is developing. I never heard about it, maybe 3 months ago. And I heard it on a podcast, actually, about Anthropic. And it's a kind of a new study about trying to understand how the AI models work, which of the, quote, neurons are firing and why, et cetera. They even have a term for it, mechanistic interpretability. And so there are people who, are scientists studying that. And I think that's something that would be appealing to lawyers and the technologists combined. It's a real important area.
And evolving rapidly. So
yeah.
And Ian, as promised, I want to get to my last question for you, which was any tips for more general for business leaders? Because I know I asked you about general counsel, that you could leave business leaders with to say, here's a tip or a couple that I learned along sort of my dealings throughout my career. Yeah,
look, first of all, don't be afraid to experiment. Don't be afraid to push the envelope, to fail. I tell my team, I think we're blessed having multiple banks in different jurisdictions. One of the things that I did when I first joined, I set up, what I called the World Cup of legal and operational errors. And what we were doing was sharing mistakes that different of our banks had made to try to help other banks in our family not make the same mistakes, and also to have people talk about mistakes, because you learn from those things. Root cause analysis. There's gold in mistakes. You learn more from those mistakes. So it's a hard stretch for me to convince business leaders to celebrate mistakes, but you really have to learn from mistakes and design your systems, your people, your culture in a way to do that, because otherwise you're just going to keep on repeating the same or similar mistakes.
And it's so critical, Ian. It's, the learning from our mistakes is critical. And to your earlier tip to general counsel, which is look at some of the places that may be a bit further ahead. What are they doing? And try to plan for that ahead of time. Because then you try to actually mitigate mistakes before they happen in the first place, which is the ideal situation.
Yeah. No, and if nothing else, you're stress testing your current status quo. You look at some of the European standards, far more stringent, et cetera. And so just having people understand them and think through, what does that mean for us if we were to go in those directions?
Excellent points. Ian, I appreciate your time today. I knew this would be a very fruitful session, and people will certainly enjoy our podcast. And it's truly been a pleasure to have you here.
No, listen, Gary, thank you very much for inviting me. It's been very enjoyable.